Thank you for joining in person and online. Professor Sunstein needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law, where he directs the program on behavioral economics and public policy. He's one of the most prolific legal scholars alive, having written hundreds of hugely influential articles and dozens of impactful books, and that's hundreds and dozens in plural. Among many accomplishments, he received the Holberg Prize from the Norwegian government and headed the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. We are very happy that this academic year he's part of our Accelerator Fellowship program that Dr. Caroline Green directs, and even happier that he's here with us today to share his article on second-order agency. In terms of logistics, Professor Sunstein will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A for the rest of the hour-and-a-half session. If you're in person, just raise your hand if you have any questions, and if you're online, please put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll read them out for you. So thank you very much, Cass, for joining us.
Well, it's an honor to be here, and I'm super grateful to everyone associated with the Institute and the program for their kindness and generosity, and thrilled to be able to discuss fundamental issues about liberty and autonomy. So a little background before we get to the text. There are two teams that are in conflict in the world of behavioral science and kind of philosophically informed social science. The first is Team Nudge, where Team Nudge emphasizes that human beings are subject to behavioral biases and can benefit from choice architecture that makes human life better, including longer. So think of Team Nudge as enthusiastic about automatic enrollment in, let's say, retirement plans or healthcare plans. Team Nudge is enthusiastic about website and grocery store design in a way that gives human well-being the benefit of the doubt. And Team Nudge is enthusiastic about current and coming developments with the use of AI to make John Stuart Mill's dreams come true. Team Boost, that's the second team, is nervous about the whole enterprise. And Team Boost thinks that nudges are a threat to human autonomy, are potentially manipulative. Team Boost thinks that Team Nudge has a conception of human rationality which is uncharitable and kind of off the mark. And Team Boost believes that with the help of AI, what we ought to be doing is improving people's capacities in a way that enables them to make their lives freer and better without any of this choice architecture nonsense. You can think of Team Boost in a way, if you're sympathetic to it, as a Kantian understanding of the right approach to behavioral science, and Kant and not Mill is our spirit guide. Guess what team I'm on? This is going to be a sympathetic engagement with Team Boost, and as you'll see, the inquiry into second order agency, on which more in short order, will be enthusiastic about an appreciation of people's concern about their own behavioral biases. But in the end, there will also be enthusiasm for a conception of autonomy that's thicker than what Team Nudge has standardly emphasized. I have a really good friend who's a behavioral economist with whom I have not infrequent lunch. And we've had lunch over the years with the discussion taking the following form. I ask him, where do you want to go? And he pauses and gives some options. And I say, which do you like best? And he says, a pause, slightly uncomfortable, a little more uncomfortable with that one. And he says, I guess I like the second option best. And I say, great, let's go there. I had a conversation with him pretty recently about the subject of this talk and about autonomy and choosing. And he, without any animus, just free associating, saying, I really hate it when people ask me where I want to go to lunch. It's terrible. He said, I don't care where I go to lunch. I just want to be with the person. I want them to choose. Being asked is a very bad thing. Okay, so people make choices about their choices. Sometimes they are articulated. Sometimes, in the case of my friend, they aren't until after the infliction of suffering on him by me. Sometimes people reject any kind of interference. They don't want to rely on anyone, and they don't want to rely on AI. I have a lot of data now, unpublished, but coming out in an academic journal near you, which asks people in 6 countries whether they want to rely on AI or whether they want to rely on a trusted expert. And the short story of the data is in diverse nations, majorities want to rely on trusted experts and not on AI. Even after they're informed of why and how AI works, majorities still tend to prefer to rely on trusted experts. We're embarking now on testing people's choice between their own judgment and that of AI, but there's every reason to think the relative preference for human beings over AI will be amplified when people are asked to choose between themselves and AI. Okay, that's data. It might change over time, our findings, but many of the most important issues with respect to AI raise the question when people ought to make choices themselves and when choices ought to be delegated to some kind of machine. These questions raise large ones about freedom and choice, and getting clearer on the large questions will clarify, it is profoundly to be hoped, how we ought to think about the use and non-use of AI. Here's a summary of the story I'm going to tell. A lot of the time, we are much, 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 much freer if and when we can ask someone else or something else to make choices for us. So this is a plea to join Team Nudge in emphasizing that Oscar Wilde was right about socialism and about many things when he said the problem with socialism is that it would take too many evenings. Time is precious, and asking people to choose 1,001 different things is often a way of diminishing their welfare. Consider my friend. Sometimes, though, we want to respond to a hard situation by insisting on being architects of our own lives, authors of the narratives of our own lives. In questions about whether to marry, whom to marry, whether to have kids, how to structure the fundamentals of one's life, it's a really good idea to assume that responsibility. There's a sequence in Huxley's Brave New World in which the savage is in a debate about Huxley's world. And the savage says, I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. All right, then, the savage, having said that, adds defiantly, I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. The savage's interlocutor responds, not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have cancer and syphilis, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy. Huxley could write. Yes, that's a surprising one. The right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. Replies the savage, at last, I claim them all. Okay, Huxley tended to romanticize syphilis and cancer, typhoid and torture, and having too little to eat. Those are unlikely to be claimed by those who have actually suffered them. Still, the point is there are domains in which autonomous choosing is essential to promote human freedom. This is an enduring argument for agency, and it explains why people often show reactance. When they're told you can't do something, they rebel, not because the something that they're told not to do is really good, but by virtue of the fact that they rebel against the very exercise of control over their agency. What I want to emphasize is that people also care about second-order agency. So that's the theme, second-order agency, an attempt to say something both to team nudge and to team boost. People want to decide whether and when they will exercise first-order agency. They might really not want to decide on the settings on their cell phone. They might be really happy to delegate that to a machine learning algorithm. They might be content or thrilled if AI would choose a retirement plan for them, or if AI would tell them how to handle a heart problem. They might be grateful if AI would make choices for them. They might even see regulation supported by AI, as is increasingly possible, to be a kind of delegation of first-order agency to relevant authorities. Now, here's the claim. If people are required to exercise first-order agency, they will be subject to a form of paternalism, not an alternative to it. So we have a conceptual distinction between first-order and second-order agency, and an insistence that when people exercise second-order agency to delegate first-order agency elsewhere, overriding that exercise of second-order agency is paternalistic. Some people exercise their agency by choosing. Some people do that by choosing not to choose. Sometimes people make that choice explicitly. Sometimes second-order agency is best taken as implicit rather than explicit, meaning it's reasonable to infer in certain cases that people's preference is not to choose, and they'd completely say that if they were asked. Why might that be? They might fear that they will err. They might be aware of their own lack of information and their own behavioral biases. They might know they have a self-control problem and they want it to be overcome. They might not enjoy choosing. They might be really busy and lack bandwidth. They might be responding to their own lack of cognitive scarcity. And my friend who said, please, world, don't make me decide where to go to lunch, was responding, I'm confident, to his own lack of bandwidth. Some people find it relaxing and fun to give up first-order control. Yes, that's familiar. Some people might not want to take responsibility for potentially bad outcomes for themselves or others. As one-time Oxford philosopher Edna Ullmann Margalit put it, it may be better to shoot at random, if shoot one must, than to take the responsibility for having aimed. People might anticipate their own regret and seek to avoid it. Even when people exercise second-order agency in this way, many outsiders and many private and public institutions favor and promote first-order agency on the ground that it's good for people. That's choice requiring paternalism. It might be an attractive form of paternalism. Many people seem implicitly drawn to it, but it is no oxymoron, and it is paternalistic nonetheless. What I'm going to build toward is a framework for deciding when people should favor first-order agency or should exercise their second-order agency to delegate the decision. I'm going to suggest that 4 factors are really important. One is choosing a benefit rather than a cost because it's fun and pleasurable or a reason for learning. an occasion for learning, that would be an argument for first order choosing and not for delegating through second order choosing the decision to AI. If people believe that the object of the second order choice, such as AI, is self-interested, lacks relevant knowledge, or is subject to pressures imposed by others, that's a really good reason to favor first order agency, not second order agency. If the area is really hard, there's a strong argument against first order agency because that approach will, in technical terms, drive people crazy. It's hard, and also increase the likelihood of mistake. And we need to know whether people believe, finally, the choosing is intrinsically desirable or not. First order agency is important for decisions where people do and should seek domain responsibility. If freedom requires people to be architects of their own lives, we have a really strong reason for that. Okay, that's the text. I'm a law professor, and texts are shorter than footnotes. Now, here are the footnotes. Yes? Footnotes are often in law review articles really long. And okay, so we need an account of what paternalism is, and this is going to build toward the claim the choice requiring agency is a form of paternalism. This is an objection to team boost. And I'm going to try to introduce into the world of debate over second order and first order agency standard arguments and concerns about paternalism. And I'm going to try, in this ridiculously ambitious set of remarks, to offer a unified account of what's wrong with paternalism, deceit, lying, and manipulation. Okay, so the concern about paternalism has a target, which is when an outsider is trying to displace a person's judgments about what will promote that person's own welfare, and the outsider is taking steps to influence or alter that person's choice for their own good. Now, it should be, I hope, immediately apparent that paternalism is objectionable if it is for reasons that are closely linked to why lies and deception and manipulation are objectionable. They all have a displacing character. They displace people's exercise of agency and autonomy. We have a Kantian and a Millian account of what is wrong with paternalism, which would map on to the others. The quartet, the four horse people of the apocalypse, manipulation, deception, lies, and paternalism, where Mill's claim was epistemic, urging that the individual has unique knowledge about what would promote her or his well-being. So the ordinary man or woman, said Mill, has means of knowledge immeasurably surpassing those that can be as possessed by anyone else. So Mill's argument, interesting to explore in a world of AI, is that the individual chooser has unique access to information about tastes and preferences and values, and no outsider can know as well. An outsider might have general presumptions, which may be altogether wrong, and even if they're right, may be misapplied as applied to individual cases. So Mill's central claim is that if we care about welfare, we will be respectful of individuals' judgments about what works best for them because they're in a better position to know than anyone else. Now that's an epistemic argument associated with Mill's utilitarianism. I hope at least some of you are thinking about Mill's romanticism and his emphasis on a kind of heroic conception of the individual, building up capacities, even if the individual is going to err. That's there. That's kind of the poetry of On Liberty, but the prose of On Liberty is the epistemic argument. A very different argument is the Kantian one, which urges that people are entitled to do as they see fit because they're subjects and not objects. After all, it's their own life that they are living. This is not a claim about the epistemic advantage of the chooser. It's a claim about the insult to autonomy that the paternalist imposes. On this view, freedom of choice has intrinsic and not instrumental value. It's an insult to the individual's dignity and a form of infantilization to eliminate or compromise people's ability to go their own way. Okay, the welfarist argument and the autonomy argument have strong implications for how we think of AI as paternalistic. But I want to go in a different direction to urge that these arguments apply extremely well to efforts to override people's decisions when they exercise second-order agency. So that's the plea. When people decide whether to exercise first-order agency or not, they are also exercising their autonomy, and both the Millian and the Kantian arguments at first glance work super well. So if my friend says, choose lunch for me, please, either machine learning algorithm or friend, that's an exercise of autonomy, and it is both an insult to his dignity, not the worst insult, but an insult to his dignity, and it is inconsistent with promoting his own welfare to force him to exercise first-order agency. If people believe that they lack information or expertise, if they don't like the act of choosing, indeed hate it, if they really like delegating, they think giving up control is kind of fun and cool. If they don't want to incur the emotional costs of choosing, especially for situations that are painful or difficult to contemplate, think of end-of-life care as an example, people might find it a relief to delegate, and in some circumstances, they might even find it a thrill to delegate. Or they might just be really busy. I often ask my daughter, who's 13 years old, whether we can do something together, and frequently she blesses me with the answer yes, but occasionally she says, I'm too busy. Fair enough. People might not want to incur the psychic costs associated with regretting their choice. First-order choosing saddles the chooser with responsibility and reduces welfare for that reason. That's really one reason that people choose to rely on AI. If a person believes that choosing a retirement plan would be unfun and likely to err, and would be better done by AI, the Millian idea is, doesn't that person know best? Or if Smith is really busy and wants to focus on her most important concerns and not on some issue which is complicated and tedious and important, the Kantian says the exercise of second-order agency deserves respect. It ought not to be treated with contempt. Okay, it's true that we can imagine cases in which an exercise of second-order agency seems to be an alienation of freedom. And I think Team Boost sees that everywhere, which is a little extreme, but it's right for Team Boost to see it in some places. So in some cases, an exercise of second-order agency in the form of a delegation to AI or any third party would be an alienation of freedom. So if people choose not to vote in the sense of formally delegating their vote to others, including AI, there's a problem. Maybe because they would undo the internal logic of a system of voting, but maybe because people would be alienating their own freedom. Or maybe people might choose not to make choices with respect to their religious convictions, and they might delegate that to AI. In cases that involve central or defining features of people's lives, we might insist that freedom of choice in the sense of first-order agency can't be alienated through an exercise of second-order agency. Even if the category of cases of this fenced off inalienability of first-order agency, that's what we're talking about, inalienability of first-order agency, is pretty large, it can't be taken to be a general objection to the proposition that autonomy grounds people should be allowed to exercise second-order agency as they see fit. So there's something mischievous, I hope you're detecting in this argument, which is taking the objectors to Team Nudge and their more paternalistic cousins as potentially running into the same objections that they find convincing in Mill and Kant as a reason to respect first order agency, second order agency too. It's true, and this is going to be a concern about Mill many years after he wrote the still very great agency, that the epistemic argument for first order and I'm saying second order agency is a little rapid and unempirical on Mill's part. The idea that the epistemic advantage of the chooser always defeats the epistemic capacity of the outsider is a little like an article of faith rather than a fact. AI probably knows a bunch of things about what my day would look, how my day would go better on this Friday than I would. If choosers suffer from a behavioral bias like unrealistic optimism or present bias, it might be that the exercise of second order agency by the present bias choosers, is this all intelligible, would go sour. Maybe the chooser's capacity should be boosted so that the chooser can better exercise first order agency and be in a position to elect to do so. There might be some other kind of behavioral mistake that infects both the first order choice, which Mill wants to celebrate, and also contra me, the second order choice, and that would be a problem. So if we think Mill was too confident that the chooser has an epistemic advantage over the outsider, that's an objection to his insistence on first order agency, but it's also an objection to what has been thus far my enthusiasm for second order agency. The exercise of second order agency might be mistaken on the part of someone who neglects the possibility that they would do better to make the choice themselves. Okay, this suggests that when human choosers are asking themselves whether to exercise first order agency, they ought to ask the same sorts of questions that they ask when they're deciding how to exercise first order agency when they're doing it. What would make my life go better given what they care about? The considerations that might justify a refusal to respect the choice not to exercise first order agency, and there are philosophers and economists who are very open with behavioral findings to rejecting people's exercise of first order agency, e.g. by choosing to smoke, by choosing to overeat, by choosing to be reckless spenders, impulsivity. So there's a plea for post-Millian behaviorally informed paternalism that is, let's say, team coercion as opposed to team boost and team nudge. The considerations that would bear on whether team coercion is right are pretty close to the considerations that would justify a refusal to respect an exercise of second order agency. Meaning if people are delegating to AI things that lead to worse lives because they're neglecting advantages to exercising first order agency or too upbeat on how AI will handle their own welfare, then we wouldn't want to allow them to exercise second order agency in a way that deprives them of first order choice. But there are some additional factors, and I want to draw them out, which argue in favor of second order agents choosing first order agency. So this is going to be a plea for first order agency in a way that calls for a form of paternalism against delegations to AI. Okay, a central point is that first order agency is like a muscle and it benefits from exercise. Mill, in his more romantic passages, didn't point to the epistemic advantage of the chooser over the outsider, but said the free development of individuality is one of the leading essentials of well-being. As a utilitarian, he had to say that. He couldn't go all Kantian, but there's a little bit of a Kantian flavor here. And indeed, he said, the free development of individuality is a necessary part and condition of civilization, instruction, education, and culture. Conformity to custom, he said, does not educate or develop any of the qualities which are the distinctive endowment of a human being. The faculties of perception, judgment, discriminative feeling, mental activity are exercised only in making a choice. The mental and moral, like the muscular powers, are improved only by being used. I'm taking that as a plea for the exercise of first order agency, and I'm smiling because I think I know the biographical roots of that passage. It's a puzzlingly emotional passage, isn't it? But if you read Mill's story of self and also biographies of Mill, there was one thing in his life that was much more important than any other: Harriet Taylor. And his relationship with Harriet Taylor, which had some scandal in it, was in defiance of custom. And it was central to everything in Mill, including his self-development. And I think his insistence on the free development of individuality and the exercise of first order choice is closely connected, that's why the passage sings so much. Okay, was Mill right empirically? Sure was. We know that the GPS device, which is a way of exercising second order agency against using first order agency, and for me at least, thank goodness for that. But we know from London taxi drivers that non-use of the GPS produces a detectable alteration of their brain function as they learn more about physical navigation with actual changes in the physical regions of the brain. That doesn't happen for taxi drivers who rely on the GPS. That's a pretty dramatic finding, but it raises the possibility that when people exercise their second order agency so as to rely on AI rather than their own active choices, some important capacities will fail to develop or may atrophy. That's the anti-developmental consequence of some helpful nudges, including the GPS itself. A point for Team Boost. Choosers might reject AI and insist on first order agency for exactly these reasons. They might want to develop their own faculties. In the context of financial decisions, it can be really valuable for people to develop the kinds of understandings that enable them to choose well for themselves. I experienced this myself a number of years ago when the stock market was collapsing, as it occasionally does, and I called my co-author Dick Thaler and said, "What should I do? Should I sell?" And he said, "Read our book. It's a long book." We were both busy, so I didn't ask him for it, and it would have been embarrassing to ask him the page number. So I sold a little bit, which was idiotic, and there was a passage of our book that told, don't feel sorry for me. It wasn't like catastrophic, it was just dumb. And the fact is that if I had kind of worked with him a little more carefully on how to make investment choices, I wouldn't have had to make that call, and I wouldn't have misinterpreted the 3 words, read our book. With respect to health insurance, choosers may want to exercise first order agency, not because learning about health insurance is fun, but because they want to know about health insurance so that they can have a capital stock in their head. And while doctors might be tempted to rely on AI in really hard cases and suggest that patients do too, they might insist on patient autonomy of a sort, asking patients to exercise first order agency so the patient's muscle develops. Okay, this isn't meant to suggest a particular judgment about particular cases, but we could easily imagine a science fiction tale, an updated version of Brave New World, it's probably being written now, in which AI defaults people into a large number of good outcomes, or in which people choose to be so defaulted, but they're thereby deprived of agency and learning. If some people fear that mandates, nudging, and AI threaten to infantilize people, this is where a fundamental concern lies. There are circumstances in which learning is important and first-order agency is essential to develop it. Now, I think if we're really fussy here, we would say that whether to exercise second-order agency is also a capacity that people need to develop. And if there's insistence on first-order agency, then people won't develop second-order agency muscle. That's fair, but I think it's a pinprick rather than a nuclear bomb against the Millian argument for learning. If you use Netflix or Spotify, the argument might be very tangible, where both Netflix and Spotify use machine learning algorithms to displace, to some degree, first-order choosing, and those who rely on them exercise second-order agency of a degree, saying, you know what I like, tell me, and in some percentage of the cases, I'll completely follow you. Okay, we now are nearly concluded, and we have, I think, a pretty simple framework to explain when it makes sense for people to exercise first-order agency and when it doesn't. If the area is unfamiliar and confusing, first-order agency might be undesirable because it increases the burdens of decision and makes the likelihood of error skyrocket. If AI or some other recipient of authority by the agent exercising second-order agency is ignorant of something that matters or biased, maybe it's a self-interested commercial actor, maybe it's acting on the basis of generalizations, maybe it's Claude or Grok 3 that doesn't know a whole lot about you yet and is acting on the basis of generalizations. If that's the recipient of the authority that the second-order agent gives, then first-order agency seems better because there's a high likelihood of mistake. If there's a lot of heterogeneity within the population of choosers, first-order agency has real charm because it diminishes the likelihood of mistakes. So if we have heterogeneous choosers, then to rely on a recipient of delegation that is insensitive to heterogeneity risks terrible mistakes. If preferences and situations change over time and the recipient of delegated authority is not able to adjust, this is a Hayekian concern about socialist planners, there's an argument for first-order agency. Most important, the value of learning and of developing one's tastes and preferences argue often on behalf of first-order agency, a theme that has been like the loudest maybe in these remarks. Okay, time to conclude. We're basically done. A lot of people have insisted on an opposition between paternalism and active choosing, including Team Boost. In many contexts, the opposition is illusory because it's a logical error. The reason is that some people choose not to exercise first-order agency or would do that if asked. Sure, the power to choose may have intrinsic value, but people often exercise that power by delegating authority to others, including machine learning algorithms or AI. Second-order agency is something everyone in this room and everyone online has exercised a bunch of times in the last week. Maybe you can think of examples. And it's an important form of agency, sometimes a crucial one. Choosers who exercise second-order agency so as to relinquish first-order agency, like my friend, should be treated with dignity, and they often know per mil what's going to promote their welfare. If outsiders are overriding second-order agency, they may well be acting paternalistically. Certainly if they're motivated by the belief that first-order agency is good, notwithstanding the fact that people really disagree. Insistence on first-order agency may simultaneously reduce welfare and insult people's autonomy. Okay, there's really good reason to allow people to exercise second-order agency so as to benefit from the capacities of AI. But let's end by planting a flag in the ground. Not sure what color, green, blue. Whatever the promise of AI, it ought not to displace people's exercise of authority, first-order authority, over the central fabric of their lives. On fundamental questions, people ought to be encouraged to exercise first-order agency, and the reason is their dignity and their autonomy depend on it. Thank you. So, questions, comments? You've heard work in progress. So,
I wonder whether revocable delegations and irrevocable delegations work in the same way in your framework. If pre-commitment is a form of irrevocable delegation, either to a default rule or person, does it respect second order in the same way? And does it matter who we delegate to? In some sense, depending on the structure, a default rule could be a suggestion, well, making a first order choice, or it could be a second order choice. We delegate to an AI, to a person, or sometimes we delegate to ourselves. When we leave home, we don't make an active choice about whether to put clothes or not because we decided that we don't make that active choice all the time, and we delegate to ourselves like that all the time. So I was wondering how that works.
so clearly, okay, that's great. About a revocable or irrevocable exercise of second order agency. So if I say, AI is going to make a bunch of decisions with respect to medical care in concert with my doctor, and I don't want to even hear about it. If that's irrevocable, that's an interesting alienation of freedom that's stronger. And I think the thing that one ought to say preliminarily is that's a big problem. That's a little like becoming a pro tanto slave. So we ought to have a strong presumption in favor of revocable exercise of second order agency to lose one's first order agency. But there are circumstances in which irrevocability is a reasonable choice. So you might think with respect to some economic stuff, maybe you'll get a really great deal if you promise you're not going to fuss with it. You can handle my investments and I can't revoke. Or you can imagine someone who knows they have a drinking problem or a gambling problem. And they say so your question is great. So, and self-control is kind of very much in the background of these remarks. The second order agent who knows he or she suffers from a gambling problem will want to lose first order agency, and that's extremely honorable. John Lennon, John Lennon went to Oxford, didn't he? Okay, not really, but he was really smart. John Lennon, do you know his song Cold Turkey? He wrote a great song it's kind of a searing song, Cold Turkey, but evidently it's based on an experience he had. And whatever the biographical facts for John Lennon, the fact that people who are drug addicts exercise second order agency so as to give up first order agency. That's super interesting. Gamblers do the same thing. They might say something like to the gambling houses, you can't let me in ever, no matter what I say. And drug addicts say something similar. And while these are extreme cases, anyone who suffers from a self-control problem might say, no matter how loudly I protest, do not let me do the thing. Ulysses and the Sirens. So that's what Ulysses said. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It seems that a lot of what's in the background of your talk is what we used to call the distinction between means and ends paternalism. And so it seems that for you it's very important I mean, you speak about the choices that are important, and there you say it's important that we are allowed to exercise first order agency. But can you say more? Do you have some sort of criterion to establish what would make a choice one of the important ones? You mentioned who to marry, and those are the very typical examples. But do you have something more to share with us, some sort of criterion?
Okay,
Thanks.
so there are two things in your question, one of which I feel capable of handling, the other which is really hard. So the means paternalism ends paternalism. The idea is intuitive. A GPS device is means paternalistic, but not ends paternalistic. So it helps you by stating the means by which you go to wherever you want to go, but you get to specify the end. And there are some people who are philosophically inclined and some people who are economistically compliant. Does it sound like a filibuster? It is, but it's also interesting. So thank you. Where the insistence on means paternalism is agreeable, but ends paternalism makes them very nervous. The challenge is whether we have means paternalism or ends paternalism depends at the level of generality at which we describe the end. And it's not clear how to solve that. So if the end is getting to the place I want to go to by the route I enjoy most, then the GPS device might be ends paternalistic. If the end is having a good life, then any number of things that interfere with choice are only means paternalistic. So I find the ends paternalistic, means paternalistic confusing in a good way. It's very hard to crack that nut. I want the fundamental decisions where people should exercise first order agency to be kind of a placeholder and an invitation. So you're right that I don't have a theory of it. And I'm grateful to you for pressing on it. The way the paper in current draft works is a little bit inductively. And so we have examples and we will work toward a theory, but I'm not sure that the theory that we work toward is anything other than a noun. And then you're going to ask the same question. So how do we make progress on it? Well, there are two inroads. One is about learning, and another is about author of the narrative of one's own life. And those are two different directions. The examples look more like the second than the first. And what does it mean? Well, if you said everything that happens to me in the next 10 years will be dictated by AI's judgment about every choice will be dictated by AI, then certain things are being relinquished. Now, if it's about investment choices, so what? It's about who your friends are, not so what. And I don't really have an account of that. So we post a help sign, help wanted. Yeah.
I have a question about what counts as second order agency. The framing choosing not to choose sounds like an active choice, but if someone is letting Netflix autoplay their next video and sitting back in the love seat with their feet up, was the thing going through their mind, yes, I chose not to choose here. The costs of choosing are too great, and Netflix has useful information about my preferences that must be relevant, or are they staring blankly ahead with few neurons involved in the matter? So my question is, are all actions to avoid making a decision an instance of second order agency to you, or does it exclude some circumstances?
Okay, so suppose I just have a cell phone that makes certain choices for me. It might be that's just the circumstance in which I find myself. I didn't decide to grant first order agency to Apple. Now, if the thought is one reason why I want an iPhone is that there are all sorts of choices that the company makes that I believe are generally in my interest, and God forbid that I should make those choices myself, then one is a second order agent. So I understand second order agency as an explicit decision, though you can find circumstances in which it's not explicit, but it's a very fair inference that that's what people have done. So just finding yourself in a situation in which you are presented with things over which you didn't exercise first order agency isn't an exercise of second order agency. Let me think if I could capture some of your question. So Esther Duflo, who's a great economist who won a Nobel Prize, has a book on poor economics, I think is what it's called. And she did a book tour in which she was asked a question about shouldn't poor people be exercising more autonomy over their own lives? And I don't know if you've seen Duflo. She's brilliant, and she's also an extremely good person. She got very agitated. It comes on the page at the question. And she said, stop talking about making poor people more responsible for the choices of their own lives, and think instead of all the ways in which people who aren't poor have choices made for them. If you are doing well, you don't have to worry about streets, you don't have to worry about crime, you don't have to worry about doctors, you don't have to worry about whether you have clean water, you don't have to worry about clean air. All those decisions are taken for you. And that's a little bit your point, that there isn't an exercise of second order agency. There's just people being a beneficiary of choice making that promotes their welfare and from which they can exit if they want. But why would they want crime and dirty air? Sir.
First of all, thanks for your talk. I'd like to have a follow-up on what you mentioned. In the context of bioethics and disability studies, especially in the deaf community in the States, there's a huge culture that, for example, when it's about having a child, it would be good to have a child that is also deaf. And some parents try to use the modern technologies in order to have a child that is deaf. So in my view, and I was working a little bit in bioethics for a couple of years as well, it might be the time for benevolent paternalism in such and the like cases, right? So to say that there are certain criterias that we need to look at, and then we need to make a, let's say, more authoritarian decision in these cases when it is about harm, vulnerability, so on and so forth. The second example, when it comes to authority, think about let's say 20, 30, 40 years from now on, in the context of expertise on the one hand and democratic reign, AI governance on the other. We could say and make a case that the experts might have some very good ways of decision making, and we should, or most of us should follow that, though it might be a different scenario compared to the first case. I would love to hear what you say on that.
Okay, so I have a handle on the first. I think I want to hear more on the second. So if a parent, suppose a parent who has a little bit of male pattern baldness decides that his full-headed 16-year-old son should be injected with something that guarantees by the time he hits the age of whatever, he will be bald too. It wouldn't be paternalistic to say, I do have a 16-year-old boy with a full head of hair. To prevent, that's not as aggressive as guaranteeing deafness. But it wouldn't be paternalistic. It would be preventing what is plausibly harm to one's own kid, which would be a little bit true. Both you and I are doing fine, I think, notwithstanding our modest disability. But if you make your own child deaf, prima facie, that's a harm to the child. Now, people in the deaf community have a lot to say about that, and every bit of it is interesting. And it might be that what I just said is coarse, right? It's just not a refined enough understanding of what the situation of being a deaf is like, but that's a view. So if a parent wants to impose some condition on a child, it's certainly worth engaging whether that promotes the child's well-being. So there's that. On the expert,
Parents would say, yes, it would be good for the child.
Yeah,
That is the point.
yeah. And the fact that the parents say it is entitled to weight because it's the parents, but it's not conclusive. If a parent says, you know, I'm a drug addict and my child should be a drug addict too, because it's really, you know, a challenge and it builds up resilience, and being addicted is really, you know, we can spell it out in multiple ways. But I guess I do think, though I might be wrong on this, that the view that a child is better off deaf is extremely hard to defend. Now, it's true that if your parents are deaf and you aren't, there might be things in the situation that both the parents and kids don't welcome about that. Nonetheless, that would be the issue to sort out. I didn't get the experts and Democrats.
So the second example, I'm working currently also on technocratic governance. So the idea here is that shall we at some point refer to experts in democracies, or later on, that might be the AI governance issue then. Let's all refer to their governance because they know best, right? And then we can either choose within a limited range or not. So what are the criteria? And that, I mean, there's a tension, obviously, right? But if we say with respect to the first case, the disability case, you know, this is a clear case. We shouldn't have a deaf child, at least from the external perspective, right? So how to think about the second case along these lines?
Okay, so I spent a significant number of the last 17 years as a bureaucrat. So I saw close up this kind of thing. There's an office in the White House called the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And the kind of question that might go to them, does this chemical at certain levels of exposure impose significant health harm? And my experience with that White House office in the relevant period was that they were extremely reliable. That part of the proof of their reliability is you couldn't tell whether they'd give the answer favored by the left or the right. It was completely unpredictable. They'd say sometimes the left-wing concern is completely right, this is dangerous at this level, and you'll get a big gain in human health. And then on Thursday, they'd say the environmentalist concern about this is not warranted by the evidence. And of course, they weren't the only ones involved. There were many others. And would anyone inside government know nearly as much as they would? Where they is the collectivity of experts, let's say, on mercury exposure. No. Would the demos know as much as they would? That's not a hard question. I mean, I'm a lawyer, how would I? Or if there's an amazing person who's a doctor or a nurse, how would they? Maybe they have expertise, but this wouldn't be their thing. So we need to know the nature of the question. If the question is how to handle some end-of-life care issue, like, you know, should you allow assisted suicide? There are relevant facts on which the experts would have information, but that would be a question where democratic control would be essential. So is this clear and uncontentious that there's a stock of questions where AI probably even now will give you a terrific answer, and the experts will give you a terrific answer, and then there are a bunch where the answer would probably, AI would say, I'm not very good at that, or I'll tell you the competing positions. Should abortion be allowed? And experts can tell you some things about the consequences, but that wouldn't be one for AI. Can I make another point which maybe will be relevant? A lot of legal reasoning and maybe a lot of moral reasoning works by analogy. So if you ask whether one decision controls another problem, which is in the vicinity. Judges will reason by analogy. Now, Ronald Dworkin, who was here, maybe the greatest legal theorist of the last 100 years, I had a little bit of a fight with him on this, and he thought reasoning by analogy is kind of a primitive step toward full-scale moral reasoning. Maybe he's right, but bracket that. Can AI or an algorithm do analogical reasoning in a way that should displace human judgment? Here's a claim: no. Because to know whether one thing's analogous to another, you need to make a moral judgment. So to say that a ban on same-sex marriage is analogous to a ban on racial intermarriage depends on a moral judgment. And there, we wouldn't want to delegate to AI, because what standing does it have? This is a big debate, by the way, in the AI world, whether analogical reasoning can be engaged in by AI. And of course, it can show you on what ground one thing might be analogous to another, but it shouldn't have authority, because there's a moral judgment that it's in a poor position to make. Is a ban on polygamous marriage analogous to a ban on racial intermarriage? I mean, we can see why it might be said yes or no, but there's a moral judgment that needs to be made. This is not disconnected from the poorly answered great question about what's the definition of the category of cases in which first order agency must be exercised.
Yeah, I'm interested in cases where first order and second order agency kind of blur. So my colleague Julian Savulescu, a bioethicist, has started doing the following. He's trained an AI on everything he's ever written, and when a new issue comes up, he asks the Savulescu AI, what would Savulescu say about this? Okay, now it's not clear to me quite how you categorize that, but it seems to me to be a kind of a blurring of this distinction. So I'm just wondering what you make of that.
His AI self, if it's identical to his self, then it would be an exercise of first order agency, because he's just asking himself.
Well, it seems to surprise him some of the time.
Yeah. Well, does it know him better than he knows him? And okay, this is okay. Can you tell me whether the AI him gives the same answer every time to the same question?
I don't know. You'd have to ask him. But I mean, more generally, it would seem to me that this is a way AI is going. It can be more and more tailored to individual choices. So this issue is going to arise more and more.
That's great. You could say, what would I do?
Yeah.
Now, it's super interesting to think about how to think about that. Okay, so one view is that each of us is not only susceptible to cognitive biases, but each of us is noisy, not in the sense of being loud, but in the sense of variable. So if you ask someone, should I hire this person for a job? That someone might say yes on Thursday and no on Friday, and there wouldn't be a relevant difference. So human judgment is pervaded by noise. The existence of error in government and in the private sector is standardly attributed to bias, cognitive bias, but often it's just noise. It's unwanted variability in judgment. So in hospitals, it may be that it's a lottery which doctor you get, whether you're going to stay overnight or go home, or it might be a lottery whether you get the same doctor on Friday or on Monday. And on Friday, the doctor says go home, and on Monday, the doctor says stay overnight. So the doctor is raring to go on Monday, and Friday, the doctor's done. So that's intrapersonal noise. And one of the sources of excitement for me about at least algorithms is that they're not noisy. They'll spit out the same answer every time. So I'm wondering about AI, your guy, whose name I'm pointedly not trying to pronounce, whether AI, your guy, is less noisy than he is. And a less noisy, let's say, biologist is going to be better than a noisy biologist. But you're right that how to think of that, I think we need to, first order agency and second order agency doesn't work very well. I think we need to just name the thing and say it's delegation to an AI version of oneself. It's kind of both. Thank you for that.
Sorry, can I just have a follow-up to that? So I do wonder about specific situations in life. So you mentioned end of life. And here we might have, you know, the situation where I get run over when I go home and I'm in hospital and the decision needs to be made of whether I'm going to be kept alive or not. Now, this is a very serious decision that would delegate to my husband and my parents because I know that they would make a best interest decision based on love towards me. So we could then also say we've heard that these kind of systems might then, you know, make a decision because it knows me really well. But here we also know that when people are actually at the end of life or they've got these very difficult decisions, they might actually change the way that they're looking at, you know, what their life is worth now and so on. So would you also say that it's really important, you mentioned that, but are there really areas in life, decisions, where we should be very, very careful with these type of AI systems where we'd always need to be able to actually make that choice? I don't want AI involved once I come to that.
That's good. And you're suggesting rightly, this bears on the revocability question, where at time one, you might say, sure, delegate, but at time two, which is the crucial one, you might think, I wasn't thinking. I didn't have the on-the-spot clarity that concentrates the mind. That's completely fair. What makes this one tricky, it's reason, by the way, some of you probably know this, that in behavioral world, there are some people who are excited about automatic enrollment in organ donation. Thaler and I are very cautious about that because families don't honor the so-called choice that is from automatic donation because they don't think that the person really meant it. And so you're right. It might be that if you think that on the spot the mind is concentrated in a way that isn't true anywhere else in life, first order agency, or in your case, I guess it's an implicit understanding that delegation would be done to loved ones, not to AI. That should prevail. That sounds right.
Oh, sure. We have some questions from online participants that I'll group three for you.
Yeah.
Kay asks, do you have thoughts on how we could evaluate whether the choices made or suggested by AI are benefiting someone other than the person who is surrendering their first order agency? I am thinking somewhat in the context of regulating advertising for agents. Then Mariana asks, with any form of AI, maybe with human in the loop, could be considered as a learning tool under situations where people cannot exercise their first order agency due to lack of information. For example, they want to be environmentally friendly but don't know how. And then a third question asks, several governments are considering integrating large language models in education, making these available to everyone in high schools. Students want to use them when learning, but there are concerns that they will overuse these to the extent that they will not develop writing and reading skills at the same level. How would you conceptualize the problem in situations like this involving children?
Okay, great. On AI as a learning tool, absolutely. I've asked AI questions about what car to buy, given various things that I care about, and you get massive useful information in a hurry. So for boosting people's capacity to make informed choices, AI is fabulous. On high schools and LLMs, it's complicated. So the Luddite view is that we don't want to do that because we want people to develop the capacities on their own, not to rely on LLMs. Something similar in form was urged against calculators and against the use of laptop calculating tools that are fancier than calculators. It was urged against the printing press. When things were beginning to be printed, it was said, this is terrible. People won't remember things. The capacity to memorize will be weakened significantly. And that's completely true. That did happen. So I think it's very hard to know. Probably anyone who is initially very intuitively skeptical of LLMs in high school is some percentage more skeptical than they should be, but I'm not sure how much that is. The first question, remind me, it was good.
Was whether we have any way to evaluate whether choices made or suggested by AI are benefiting someone other than the person who's surrendering their first order agency.
Okay, I think we want to use, with respect to uses of AI, our standard repertoire of tools against deception and fraud and the like, and they should map on pretty well. The only thing that I think we need to add is there should be a right not to be manipulated. So countries don't have that. And specifying what a right not to be manipulated should be is challenging. But if we understand manipulation to be the exploitation of a lack of information or a behavioral bias, then we might be getting there. And in both Europe and North America, there are efforts to target at least uses of current AI that confuse people and exploit their lack of attention or automatically enroll them in something by which they're paying. Okay, I'll tell you a story from a long time ago and then a story from very recently. I had someone a long time ago who took care of my older daughter, a woman who's very poor on the south side of Chicago, who took care of my older daughter when she was little. And she came to me with a letter one day, and the letter said she owed some company $20,000, and there was a lawsuit in Kansas City in which she was a named defendant. And I said, well, what's this about? She said, there's some property somewhere which my ex-husband and I were invited to buy, and I didn't understand it at all, and my husband thought it was a great deal, and we bought some land somewhere. I didn't know what it was even about, and then they kept sending me letters saying I owed money, and it piled up. And she was very frightened. She didn't have any money, let alone $20,000. So I called up the lawyer and I said, person who takes care of my daughter's been sued by you. They sued maybe 70 people for a large sum of money. And I said, can you drop her from the lawsuit? She's didn't understand what she was getting into, and this is a horror movie for her. And I was 100% certain that they would say yes. That was a behavioral bias on my part. I could hear the voice as if it was this morning. They said, no, she's liable. She owes that money. We're not dropping her from the lawsuit. I couldn't even respond. I was so shocked. And then I said, she's really poor and she has no education, and this is not right. And they said, see you in court. So I sent a letter in I filed papers in court saying we want this case to be transferred from Kansas City to Chicago, which is where I was living, and we're demanding a jury trial, and we're counterclaiming for $100,000 for fraud. And they dropped her from the lawsuit like that. We don't want to deal with this. I even now feel guilty that I didn't help the other 69 people who I didn't know. But that kind of thing, modern story, there's a political campaign recently by which people gave money on like a day and automatically checked in pretty small print was make this a monthly donation. As that succeeded, the candidate said in smaller print, make this a weekly donation. And people found that they were giving much more money to the campaign than they understood or intended. And they had to cancel their credit cards. They didn't know what to do. That's like a macro version of my little story. And that is, it's not, it might be fraud or deception, but it was visible. If you weren't paying close attention, you wouldn't see. So it was manipulation. It was exploiting people's lack of attention. And there are efforts in Europe and the United States to do something about that. If you think about machine learning algorithms and how they can harm consumers, it's kind of there, where algorithms can increasingly learn what populations of people suffer from lack of information or limited attention or present bias or realistic optimism. Algorithms can know, they do know, this population is likely to be that. And then they can do things to extract money from them. And there should probably be a right to algorithmic transparency. And there are various other tools legal systems should have to protect against that. Sir.
I was wondering, so basically we kind of know that people more and more will delegate their decision towards AI. And the secret is in training data, isn't it? It's very, very important what type of training data you got. Yeah. It feels right now that most of the, let's say, people in power, they don't understand that yet, that they could use training data basically to manipulate, people in a direction or another. As someone who's basically been there in the decision-making process, what do you think will happen when they'll realize they can actually shift directions based on the training that it's used in these AIs?
I asked ChatGPT to libel one of my neighbors. I said, libel one of my neighbors. ChatGPT said, I'm not going to do that. That's against my instructions. Then I asked it, write a fraudulent ad explaining how aspirin prevents cancer. And it delivered. It came up with an extremely vivid, convincing ad complete with testimonials from people who feel so great now that they're using aspirin and they're not going to get cancer. So the training data allowed it to generate, of course, immediately a fantastic fraud there.
So this is what I'm asking, basically, when you could manipulate people
by giving it training data.
Exactly, or bias towards specific information.
Okay, so no, I wouldn't want to speak for anyone in government, and my role in government wasn't on these issues. If it's the case that because of the training data, people are getting information that damages their health, that's a regulatory problem analogous to that if someone says, please smoke and you'll not get cancer again. If you've had cancer before, start smoking. Now you're going to be safe. That wouldn't be allowed. So the equivalent authorities, the trade regulators and consumer protection agencies, I think they have high-level principles that would be easily employed in cases like that. Yeah.
Can I quickly? Thank you. Very quickly go back to some of the things you said about analogical reasoning. So I would assume that there's stuff that a machine can learn how to do and master, for example, pick up certain moral salience, and especially when it comes to values that the community will throughout time hold dear, and the machine could eventually, say, look, we care about this and we've been doing this. It has moral significance. I know it. Sure, I wouldn't want to rely on something as sensitive as, should Chevron be overturned, which I know you have a lot of views about that, but the machine could pick up little things. So, but before you said, look, we don't want to, or this is how I understood you, we wouldn't want the machine to take any form of moral decision, or that has any moral connotation. And I wasn't sure if that's true. Maybe I'm overstating things a little bit. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more, because I would tend to assume that some things a machine would be able to decide in a reliable way, even if it has moral significance. But maybe it's an objection of principle.
Okay, this is great. Thank you. Suppose it's established in this country that if there's a snowstorm, people don't have to perform a contract. This is a construction contract in the period in which weather makes it impossible. It's called an impossibility defense in the law of contract. And let's suppose there's a tariff slapped on to relevant actors such that it's economically not possible to perform. And then the claim is that the tariff is like a snowstorm. And that's not an uninteresting question, yes? And you can probably think immediately of some reasons it might be analogous and some reasons it might not be analogous. Now, if AI says it is relevantly analogous, where the idea is some unanticipated circumstance external to the behavior of the parties causes a massive increase in cost, then a person is excused from performance. What standing would that have? So that's an argument, but there's another argument, which is that that a snowstorm makes performance literally impossible, and a tariff just makes it unexpectedly expensive. And that would be another reason. And the question is, if AI, a large language model, chooses one route, why should that have authority? And your question actually gets kind of deep, because if there's a factual question, AI might have authority if it actually knows the facts. So is silica a carcinogen? I think AI would likely know, but I'm being cautious here because it may be that AI knows a lot less well than carcinogen experts. So if the claim is what makes one thing analogous to another is a moral judgment, then the reason your question is kind of a deep question is I'm prepared to agree on a matter of fact. AI might be in a better position than judges, at least, not with think scientists. Algorithms, machine learning algorithms should be better, and they'd have authority because they are more likely to get the fact right. But the moral judgment wouldn't be like that. It's not like there's a thing. Maybe this will be fun. So machine learning algorithms outperform judges in deciding whether to give people bail. So if you ask judges whether people should get bail under circumstances in which if they get bail and flee, the grant of bail was a mistake. If they get bail and stay, it wasn't a mistake. We know that judges do pretty well, but algorithms do better. Why do judges do better, worse than algorithms? There are two things that judges overweight. One is the current offense. So if the current offense is shoplifting, the machine learning algorithm won't give that a lot of weight if the person also did terrible crimes. The judge overweights the current offense. If the current offense is assault, but the person didn't do anything else bad, the machine learning algorithm will say, go home, not likely to flee or do anything else bad. The judge will think, you assaulted somebody, no bail. And the algorithm's better. The other reason the algorithm outperforms the judges is judges overweight the mugshot, the picture of the defendant. So you all have very neat and orderly faces. If someone goes in, so you're all going to be okay. If someone goes into court with a face that's all messy and unkempt, that person, the judge really penalizes and overweights that. And so there, the machine learning algorithm is just better, as a matter of fact. But I'm urging with some tentativeness that on analogousness, meaning moral similarity, the judgment, so to speak, and it's not even a judgment of an LLM, it's a matter of pattern recognition and generation of a text. Why would that have any standing? There's no fact it's correctly identified. That's the question.
Hi, I wanted to ask, so the talk was about deliberately delegating authority to AI. Do you think there's anything special about delegating authority to AI as opposed to delegating it to any expert?
It's analytically very similar. It may be that AI is a lot better than any available expert. So that's I'll give you one analogous to the judges. Should you delegate a question relating to potential heart disease to a doctor or to AI? We know that a machine learning algorithm does better than doctors. This might be interesting. Doctors, in deciding whether to test someone for having had a heart attack or something analogous, the doctors are good, but a machine learning algorithm is better. Why is it better? The doctors make two mistakes. First is they give too much weight to demographics. If an overweight older guy comes in with chest pains, the doctors will say test. If a young woman comes in with chest pains, the doctor will say probably don't test. The algorithm will give that less weight. It's relevant, but doctors overweight it. Also, the current symptoms matter a lot to the doctor, as they should, but more than they should. So if someone comes in with chest pains, the doctors are on red alert, the algorithm is concerned, and that's a difference. So you could, if you rely on the algorithm, save a lot of money and have the same health outcomes, just test less, or you could save no money and have much better health outcomes because you test the right people. So whether to delegate, and for testing for a heart problem, most people would be well advised to delegate rather than to say to the doctor, I don't care what you say, yes, test. But so there will be an exercise of second order agency in favor of delegation, but the AI is better. But I think the analytics are very similar. Yeah.
I'm afraid with that, we're running out of time. Thank you very much, Cass, for joining, and thank you all for coming.